The smell hit Dean Martin before anything else. Antiseptic, morphine, and something deeper. The metallic scent of young men whose bodies had been torn apart 10,000 miles from home. Ward 7 at Walter Reed Army Medical Center was supposed to be restricted to family only, but the night nurse, a tired woman named Patricia, who had lost her own son in Da Nang, had quietly unlocked the door when she saw the famous face at her desk. "Bed 14, she whispered. "Private Danny Marchetti, 20 years old, from Cleveland, been asking for you for 3 days." It was November 1967, and America was bleeding in Vietnam. Every night, the news showed body counts, protest marches, and politicians arguing about a war that seemed to have no end. But Dean Martin wasn't here for politics. He was here because Danny Marchetti's mother had called him, sobbing, begging the famous Italian-American singer to visit her boy before he died. "He loves your music," Maria Marchetti had said through tears. "He used to play That's Amore on his guitar before this happened. Please, Mr. Martin, he's dying, and he keeps asking if Dean Martin knows he exists." Dean walked slowly through the ward, past beds filled with boys who should have been thinking about college, girls, and weekend parties. Instead, they lay there with missing limbs, bandaged faces, and eyes that had seen too much. Some were awake, staring at the ceiling. Others were sedated, lost in drug-induced dreams that were probably better than reality. Danny Marchetti was in the bed by the window, though the blinds were drawn. Half his face was bandaged, and his left leg was gone from the knee down. But when he saw Dean approach, his good eye went wide with disbelief. "Holy shit," Danny whispered. "You're really here." "Watch your language, soldier," Dean said gently, pulling up a chair. "There might be ladies present." Danny laughed, a sound that was half joy, half sob. "My mom called you, didn't she? Jesus, I'm so embarrassed. She didn't have to do anything," Dean interrupted, settling into the uncomfortable hospital chair. "But she loves you, and that's reason enough. How you feeling, kid?" Danny's laugh turned bitter. "Oh, I'm great. Really living the dream here. Vietnam vacation package. Includes free shrapnel removal and complimentary amputation." Dean studied the young man's face, or what he could see of it under the bandages. Danny couldn't have been more than 20, probably looked like Dean's own son, Dean Paul, before the war got its teeth into him. "You play guitar?" Dean asked, nodding toward a battered acoustic guitar leaning against the wall. "Used to. Kinda hard now with—" Danny gestured vaguely at his missing leg and the cast on his right arm. "Seems like everything I used to do is in the used to category now." Dean picked up the guitar, tested the tuning, adjusted a few strings. "You know what I think? I think used to is just another way of saying ready to learn something new." Without fanfare, without any announcement, Dean Martin began to play. Not one of his hit songs, not something the other patients would recognize. Just a gentle, improvised melody that seemed to fill the ward with something it had been missing. Peace. One by one, the other wounded soldiers turned toward the sound. Those who could sit up did. Those who couldn't craned their necks. A few tried to hide tears, but most had given up pretending they were too tough to cry. Dean played for 20 minutes, sometimes humming, sometimes just letting the guitar speak for itself. When he finished, the ward was completely silent, except for the ever-present hum of medical equipment and the distant sound of helicopters bringing in more casualties. "That was beautiful," Danny said quietly. "What was it?" "Something I just made up," Dean replied, setting the guitar aside. "Sometimes the best music is the kind that doesn't have a name. It just exists for one moment, for one person who needs to hear it." Dean visited Ward 7 every Tuesday night for the next 6 months. He never announced it, never called the press, never mentioned it in interviews. He just showed up, signed in as D. Crocetti, his birth name, and spent 3 hours with boys who were learning that war wasn't anything like the movies. Patricia, the night nurse, became his unofficial coordinator. She would tell him about new patients, which ones were having the worst nights, who had just received bad news from doctors or worse news from home. Dean adapted his visits accordingly, spending extra time with the kids who needed it most. Private Marcus Washington from Detroit had lost both eyes to a grenade blast. Dean sat with him for hours, describing the colors outside his hospital window, talking about music theory, teaching him to play harmonica by feel alone. Corporal James Murphy from Boston had taken shrapnel in his throat and couldn't speak above a whisper. Dean brought him a small tape recorder and taught him to communicate through tapping rhythms, turning his silence into a different kind of music. Sergeant Billy Crawford from Oklahoma had survived a helicopter crash but watched his best friend burn to death in front of him. He hadn't slept more than an hour at a time since returning stateside. Dean would sit with him during the worst nights, playing quiet songs until Billy finally drifted off. "Why do you come here?" Billy asked him one night during a particularly bad episode. "I mean, really, why? You could be anywhere, with anyone. Why spend your Tuesday nights with a bunch of broken soldiers?" Dean was quiet for a long moment, smoking a cigarette by the open window while Billy stared at the ceiling. "You know what my job is, Billy," Dean finally said. "My job is to make people forget their troubles for a few hours. I sing songs, tell jokes, act in movies, all so people can escape from whatever's hurting them. But you guys, you can't escape. Your troubles are real, and they're permanent. And no amount of entertainment is going to fix what happened to you in that jungle. So why come? Because maybe what you need isn't someone to help you forget. Maybe what you need is someone to remember with you." That conversation changed something fundamental about Dean's visits. Instead of just performing, he began to listen. Really listen. The boys started telling him about Vietnam, not the sanitized version from the news, but the real war. The fear, the brotherhood, the moral confusion, the guilt of surviving when others didn't. Dean heard stories that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Bobby Martinez from Phoenix, who had been forced to shoot a 12-year-old boy who was carrying grenades. Kevin O'Brien from Chicago, who had held his best friend's hand while he died in a rice paddy, promising to tell his mother he hadn't suffered. Tommy Rodriguez from El Paso, who had stepped on a mine meant for someone else and couldn't stop wondering if that someone else made it home. These weren't political stories. They weren't about the rightness or wrongness of the war. They were about young men who had been asked to do impossible things and were trying to live with the consequences. The breaking point came in April 1968. Dean arrived for his usual Tuesday visit to find Ward 7 in chaos. A new patient had been brought in that afternoon, a 19-year-old kid named David Sterling from a small town in Iowa. David had been caught in an ambush that killed everyone in his unit except him. He was physically uninjured, but mentally he was somewhere else entirely. "He hasn't stopped screaming," Patricia told Dean. "The doctors sedated him twice, but he fights through it. He thinks he's still in the jungle." Dean found David in the isolation room, tied to his bed for his own safety. The kid was thrashing against the restraints, calling out names, begging someone named Martinez to stay down, screaming about incoming mortars that existed only in his memory. Dean pulled a chair up to David's bed and began to play guitar, softly at first, then gradually louder, trying to break through the wall of trauma that had trapped the young man in Vietnam. It took 4 hours. Slowly, gradually, David's screaming subsided. His eyes began to focus on the present moment instead of the battlefield in his mind. When he finally stopped thrashing and looked directly at Dean, he said the first coherent words anyone had heard from him. "Is the music real?" "Yeah, kid," Dean said gently. "The music is real. You're safe. You're home." David started to cry, deep, gut-wrenching sobs that seemed to come from his soul. Dean set aside his guitar and took the young man's hand, violating every hospital protocol about patient contact. "I couldn't save them," David whispered. "I couldn't save any of them. They're all dead, and I'm here, and I don't know why." "Sometimes there is no why," Dean said quietly. "Sometimes bad things happen to good people, and there's no reason, no lesson, no bigger plan. Sometimes you just have to find a way to keep breathing." How? Dean thought about that question for a long time. How do you tell a 19-year-old kid that life is worth living when he's watched his friends die? How do you offer hope to someone who's seen the worst humanity has to offer? "You find something worth living for," Dean said finally. "Maybe it's music. Maybe it's helping other people who've been through what you've been through. Maybe it's just the promise that tomorrow might hurt a little less than today. You find one thing and you hold on to it and you use it to pull yourself forward one day at a time." David squeezed Dean's hand. Will you come back?" "Every Tuesday, kid. Every Tuesday." But 3 weeks later, David Sterling was found in his hospital room, having taken his own life during the night shift. He left a note that simply said, "Tell Dean the music helped, but it wasn't enough." Dean Martin stopped visiting Ward 7 after that. Not because he was angry, not because he was afraid, but because David's death had shown him something he wasn't prepared to face: his limitations. For all his fame, all his talent, all his good intentions, he couldn't save everyone. Sometimes music wasn't enough. Sometimes friendship wasn't enough. Sometimes the wounds were too deep to heal. Patricia, the night nurse, called him repeatedly. The other patients asked about him every Tuesday. But Dean couldn't bring himself to walk back through those doors, knowing that David Sterling had found his music insufficient to keep living. It was Frank Sinatra who finally confronted him about it. "You're torturing yourself over something that was never your responsibility," Frank said bluntly during a dinner at Jilly's in May 1968. "That kid was broken long before he met you. The war broke him, not you." "I should have done more," Dean said, stirring his drink absently. "I should have found a way to reach him." "Bullshit," Frank shot back. "You can't save everyone, Dino. Nobody can. But think about all the kids you did help. Think about Danny Marchetti. He's going home next month because you gave him a reason to try. Think about Billy Crawford. He's sleeping through the night now. Think about Marcus Washington. He's learning to read Braille and talking about going back to school." Frank leaned forward, his voice intense. "You think David Sterling would want you to stop helping the others? You think he'd want his death to mean that dozens of other kids don't get the comfort you were bringing them?" Dean was quiet for a long moment. "What if it happens again? What if I can't save the next one?" "Then you can't save the next one," Frank said simply. "But maybe you save the one after that, or the one after that. You keep showing up, keep playing music, keep being human with them. That's all anyone can ask." 2 weeks later, Dean Martin returned to Ward 7. The patients who were still there welcomed him back like a returning hero. New wounded soldiers looked at him with a mixture of hope and skepticism: hope that he could help, skepticism that anyone who hadn't been there could understand. Dean's approach was different now. He was more honest about his limitations, more direct about the fact that he couldn't fix what had been broken. But he could bear witness to it. He could sit with it. He could play music in the presence of pain without promising that the music would make the pain go away. "I'm not here to cure you," he told a new group of patients that first night back. "I'm not here to tell you everything's going to be okay, because maybe it won't be. I'm here because you fought for this country, and now this country owes you something. Not just medical care, not just disability payments, but recognition, acknowledgement. Someone to sit with you and say, 'I see what you've been through, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter.'" Dean continued his Tuesday night visits until 1970, when the last of the Vietnam wounded were transferred to other facilities or discharged to outpatient care. In total, he spent time with over 300 wounded veterans, playing music, listening to stories, and bearing witness to the cost of war. He never spoke about these visits publicly. When reporters asked where he spent his Tuesday nights, he simply said he had personal commitments. The only people who knew were the medical staff, the wounded soldiers, and a few close friends like Frank Sinatra, who helped him process the emotional weight of what he was seeing. In 1985, 15 years after his last hospital visit, Dean received a letter that changed everything. The return address was Boston, Massachusetts, and the handwriting was careful, formal. Inside, Dean found a photograph of a middle-aged man in graduation regalia, standing next to a woman and 2 small children. "Dear Dean," the letter began, "you probably won't remember me. I was Corporal James Murphy from Boston. I was in Ward 7 at Walter Reed in 1968. I was the one who couldn't speak above a whisper because of the shrapnel in my throat. I wanted you to know that I graduated from law school last month. I'm going to work with veterans' rights organizations, helping guys like we were get the benefits and recognition they deserve. My wife, the woman in the photo, says I should have written you years ago, but I wasn't sure you'd remember me. But I remember you, every Tuesday night, sitting with us when you could have been anywhere else, teaching me that rhythm could be another kind of language, showing me that being broken didn't mean being worthless. I named my son David, not after any family member, but after David Sterling. I wanted to make sure someone remembered him not just as a tragedy, but as a person who mattered, someone who deserved to be honored. Thank you, Dean, not just for the music, but for seeing us as human beings when the world saw us as casualties. You'll never know how much that meant. Your friend, always, James Murphy." Dean Martin kept that letter in his wallet until the day he died. Over the years, more letters came. Danny Marchetti became a high school music teacher, using the confidence Dean had helped him rebuild to inspire other young people. Billy Crawford started a veterans support group in Oklahoma, helping other soldiers deal with trauma and survivor's guilt. Marcus Washington became a social worker specializing in helping disabled veterans transition back to civilian life. Not all the stories had happy endings. Some of the soldiers Dean had visited never fully recovered from their physical wounds or psychological trauma. Some struggled with addiction, homelessness, and ongoing mental health issues. A few, like David Sterling, found their pain too great to bear. But for those who did find a way forward, Dean Martin's Tuesday night visits had been a crucial part of their healing process. Not because he had magical powers or could fix what was broken, but because he had treated them with dignity when they felt most worthless, sat with them when they felt most alone, and reminded them through music that they were still human beings capable of beauty and connection. In his final years, as Dean grew increasingly reclusive and distant from the entertainment world, he would sometimes listen to recordings of the songs he had played at Walter Reed. Not his professional recordings, but bootleg tapes that some of the wounded soldiers had made of his impromptu performances. The quality was terrible, scratchy, full of background noise from medical equipment and whispered conversations. But Dean preferred these recordings to any of his polished studio work because they captured something that couldn't be engineered or produced: the sound of music being used for its most fundamental purpose, to help human beings feel less alone. Dean Martin died on Christmas Day 1995, and his funeral was attended by hundreds of celebrities and industry figures. But also present, standing quietly in the back, was a group of men in their 50s and 60s, some in wheelchairs, some using canes, all wearing small pins that read, "Ward 7. They had come to honor the man who had shown them that fame meant nothing if it wasn't used to acknowledge the humanity of others. The man who had spent his Tuesday nights for 3 years proving that sometimes the most important performances are the ones no audience ever sees. After the service, James Murphy, now a successful attorney and veterans' rights advocate, was approached by a reporter who asked what Dean Martin had meant to him. Murphy thought for a moment, then said, "Dean taught me that healing doesn't always mean getting better. Sometimes it just means learning to live with dignity while you carry your wounds. He showed me that being broken doesn't disqualify you from being beautiful." The reporter pressed for details about Dean's hospital visits, but Murphy just smiled and shook his head. "Some stories aren't meant for the newspapers," he said. "Some acts of kindness are meant to stay private." Dean understood that, and we honored that, even after all these years. Today, the James Murphy Veterans Legal Advocacy Center in Boston helps thousands of veterans navigate the complex process of getting the benefits and recognition they deserve. In the waiting room, visitors can hear soft background music, recordings of Dean Martin songs, played not for nostalgia, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful healing happens when someone simply chooses to sit with you in your pain. And every Tuesday evening, somewhere in America, a group of aging Vietnam veterans gets together to share stories, support each other, and remember the Tuesday nights when a famous singer showed them that their wounds didn't define their worth. They call themselves the Dean Martin Society, though they're not officially affiliated with his estate or any entertainment organization. They're just a group of men who learned from a master that the most important music is the kind that helps people feel less alone. The true measure of Dean Martin's life wasn't his record sales or his movie box office numbers. It was counted in Tuesday nights, in hospital rooms, in the quiet moments when he chose compassion over comfort, service over celebrity. It was counted in the lives of young men who learned that survival was possible, that dignity was recoverable, and that someone, somewhere, understood that their sacrifice had meaning. And perhaps most importantly, it was counted in the understanding that sometimes the greatest performance of your life is the one that nobody else gets to see, the one that exists solely for the person who needs it most, in the moment they need it most. Dean Martin's Tuesday night legacy lives on, not in any concert hall or recording studio, but in the quiet acts of kindness performed by people who learned from him that fame is worthless unless it's used to acknowledge the dignity of those who suffer for others. Sometimes the most important music is played in hospital wards at midnight. Sometimes the most meaningful performances happen when only one person is listening. And sometimes the greatest love story is between an entertainer and the wounded soldiers who taught him what courage really means. That was Dean Martin's greatest role, not the king of cool, but the man who showed up on Tuesday nights to remind broken warriors that they were still worth loving, still worth honoring, still worth the gift of music and human connection.